She did not cry. That was the part nobody understood. When Nathaniel Ashford stood before 200 guests in his own ballroom, the most powerful man in Virginia, and opened his mouth to introduce his wife of 6 years, and went silent, Clara did not flinch. She simply looked at him. And in that silence, something inside her did not break. It finished. If this story touched something in you, something you've felt but never had words for, subscribe to this channel, follow until the very last word, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 came to Virginia like a promise nobody intended to keep. Hot, breathless. The kind of July that made the fields shimmer at noon and turned the creek behind Ashford Manor into a slow, lazy ribbon of brown water. Fireflies rose at dusk. Mockingbirds sang through the night. And the great house at the top of the hill, all white columns and dark shuttered windows, stood the way it always stood. Like it was waiting for something. Or pretending it didn't need to. Clara Ashford had learned to live the same way. She was 26 years old that summer, married 6 years to the most powerful landowner in Virginia. 6 years of managing his household. 6 years of standing at his side at every dinner, every county gathering, every Sunday service, where people bowed their heads to God and then immediately turned to whisper about Nathaniel Ashford's fortune. 6 years. And that evening, dressed in pale blue silk, with her chestnut hair pinned carefully at the back of her neck, Clara stood in the entrance hall of Ashford Manor and adjusted the cuffs of her gloves. Alone. Nathaniel had gone downstairs an hour before her. She had not been invited to walk with him. She told herself that did not matter. She had been telling herself a great many things did not matter for 6 years. The ballroom was already full when she descended the staircase. 200 guests at least. Virginia's finest families. The Caldwells, the Marshes, the Hargroves, in their summer silks and military coats, standing beneath a chandelier that threw golden light across the floor. The smell of beeswax candles and honeysuckle. A string quartet playing something soft in the corner. Clara moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms in this house, quietly, carefully, like a woman who had learned not to take up too much space. She nodded to Mrs. Hargrove, smiled at the Reverend's wife, accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing servant, and stood near the window where the evening air came through cool and clean. Nobody approached her, not because they disliked her. That was the particular cruelty of her situation. Nobody disliked Clara Ashford. They simply didn't think about her very much at all. She was Nathaniel's wife, a pleasant woman, quiet, well-mannered, a piece of furniture that smiled. She watched her husband across the room. Nathaniel Ashford was not a man you overlooked. He was tall, taller than most men in the room, with dark hair gone slightly silver at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same Virginia granite that lined the creek beds on his property. He wore his black coat with the ease of a man who had never once in his life wondered whether he looked powerful enough. He didn't need to wonder. Everyone in that room already knew. He was laughing at something Governor Randolph's representative had said. A barrel-chested man named Colonel Everett Hayes, who had ridden in from Richmond that afternoon with 2 carriages and a letter of introduction. Hayes was important. That much was clear from the way Nathaniel was giving him his full attention. Clara recognized that attention. The particular way Nathaniel leaned slightly forward when he considered a man worth impressing. The way his voice dropped half a register. The way his eyes sharpened. She had never once in 6 years been the recipient of that attention. She looked back at her lemonade. "Jen, Mrs. Ashford." The voice came from beside her. She turned. A young woman stood there, 18, perhaps 19, in a yellow dress that cost more than most families in Ashford County earned in a season. She had dark eyes and a smile that was perfectly constructed to look warm, while conveying something else entirely. Miss Helena Marsh, the youngest daughter of William Marsh, whose tobacco acreage bordered the Ashford property to the south. "Miss Marsh," Clara said. "What a lovely dress." "Thank you." Helena's eyes traveled across the room toward Nathaniel. "Mr. Ashford seems to be in excellent spirits tonight." He does. Colonel Hayes is very important, I understand. Something to do with the federal land grants. Helena turned back to Clara with an expression of practiced concern. You must be so proud. Your husband manages such significant affairs. I am, Clara said evenly. It must be fulfilling, Helena continued, to support a man with so much responsibility. Even if, she paused, touched her fan to her lips. Well, even if the demands of his position leave him with very little time for domestic matters. Clara looked at her. Helena looked back. Two women in a ballroom having a conversation that was entirely about something else. The lemonade is very good this evening, Clara said pleasantly. Mrs. Boone must have used the mint from the south garden. Helena blinked, then smiled thinly. Yes, I suppose she did. She drifted away. Clara exhaled. She was very tired of being managed by young women in yellow dresses. Across the room, she became aware of movement. Nathaniel was turning. Not turning the way a man turns when he spots something interesting across a room, that slow, deliberate pivot of power. He was turning the way a man turns when his host instinct kicks in, and he has remembered suddenly that there is a social obligation he has not yet fulfilled. He was looking for her. Clara felt something complicated happen in her chest. Some combination of hope and the memory of hope, which is a sadder thing entirely. She set down her lemonade. She smoothed her skirts. She walked toward him. The distance between them was perhaps 20 feet. She crossed it carefully around a cluster of Hargrove cousins past the edge of the card table, where old Thomas Caldwell was losing what appeared to be a significant amount of money to two younger men who were pretending to be surprised by it. She stopped at Nathaniel's elbow. Nathaniel, she said. He glanced at her. A brief glance, the kind you give a piece of correspondence you intend to read later. Clara, good. Stay here a moment. He turned back to Colonel Hayes. Hayes was a large man with the kind of mustache that required daily commitment. He held his glass of bourbon with the confidence of a man who had never once reached for something and found it out of reach. Colonel Hayes, Nathaniel said, Virginia has no stronger partnership than the one between the Ashford lands and the federal survey teams. I think you'll find, Mr. Ashford? Hayes's eyes moved to Clara. A polite acknowledgement, the kind you give to furniture that has arranged itself pleasantly. Is this your... My wife, Nathaniel said, and then opened his mouth to say her name, and stopped. Clara felt it before she understood it. She felt it in the way the air changed. The way Nathaniel's jaw stayed open for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. The way his eyes very briefly went somewhere else. Not to her. Somewhere inward searching. 200 people in the room. Music still playing. And her husband was standing beside her in front of the most important guest of the evening, and he could not find her name. His wife's name. 6 years. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds, perhaps 5. It felt like something much longer. Clara watched his face. She watched the moment he found his footing again, that slight squaring of the shoulders, the almost imperceptible flex of his jaw, and she knew with complete certainty that he was not going to recover this gracefully. He was going to pretend. My wife, he repeated, and gestured toward her with one hand, as though the gesture itself could function as an introduction. Colonel Hayes was not a foolish man. His eyes moved from Nathaniel to Clara, and back to Nathaniel with the practiced discretion of a man who had witnessed social disasters before, and knew that the kindest thing was to move quickly past them. Charming, he said. My name is Clara, she said clearly. Clara Whitmore Ashford. Her voice was steady, her hands were steady. Nothing about her externally was anything other than perfectly composed. Mrs. Ashford. Hayes took her hand. Your husband speaks highly of the estate's management. You must be a great support to him. I try to be, she said. She smiled. She did not look at Nathaniel. They did not speak of it that night. Nathaniel moved on to the next conversation, then the next, and Clara watched him, the way she had watched him for 6 years, from a small, quiet distance, and thought about what had just happened. She thought about the silence. Those 4 or 5 or 10, or however many seconds in which the man she had married could not locate her name in the landscape of his mind. She thought about what that meant. Not as an insult. She was past taking insults personally. What she was thinking about was geography. What it said about the kind of space she occupied in his life, that her name could simply not be there. Not hidden. Not forgotten in the way you forget something you once valued and have since misplaced. Just absent. As though it had never been given a home. As though she had never been given a home. The string quartet played something slow and sweet. A couple moved past her on their way to the dance floor, the woman laughing at something the man had murmured in her ear. Clara watched them go. She thought, when was the last time Nathaniel spoke to her in a way that required no one else to be present? She couldn't remember. She thought, when was the last time she had sat at her husband's side, not as a prop, not as a social accessory, but as the person he most wanted to be near? She couldn't remember that either. Upstairs. Much later. The party still going below. Clara climbed the stairs alone. The hallway on the second floor was lit by 2 oil lamps, their light soft and uneven, casting long shadows against the wallpaper that she had chosen herself in the first year of their marriage. A deep cream with small blue flowers. She had thought it elegant. She had thought when she chose it that Nathaniel might notice it, might say something. He never had. She stopped in front of the portrait. It hung at the end of the hallway, large and formal, commissioned 2 years into the marriage by a painter from Philadelphia. Nathaniel stood in the center. She stood slightly to his left, her hand resting on the arm of a chair between them. Both of them looking at the painter. Both of them in their finest clothes. Neither of them looking at each other. She had not noticed that when the portrait was unveiled. She noticed it now. She stood in front of that portrait for a long time. I have been waiting, she said quietly to herself, to the woman in the painting, for something that was never going to arrive. She pressed her fingertips briefly against the frame. Cold brass. Solid. Then she turned and went to her room. She did not cry. She had expected to. She had half prepared for it the way you half prepare for a storm the almanac has been predicting. She had brought her hands together in her lap and sat on the edge of her bed in her fine blue dress and waited for the grief to arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was something quieter and in some ways more dangerous. Clarity. She thought about what she had been doing for 6 years. The specific daily actions of a life spent in service to a man who had not once asked her what she needed. She woke before him and reviewed the household accounts. She managed the servants, 12 of them, with a system so efficient that Nathaniel had never once had to think about whether there would be clean linens or a hot meal or the right wine for the right guest. She planted the kitchen garden because the cook needed it. She mended the fence between the east pasture and the Hargrove property because the steward had been sick. She organized donations for the families of the men who had gone to fight in the war that had finally blessedly ended 4 years ago. She did all of this, and her husband, standing in his own ballroom, could not remember her name. She removed her gloves. She unpinned her hair. She thought, what am I waiting for? She thought, what exactly have I been waiting for this whole time? She did not have an answer that satisfied her. That was the problem. She had been waiting, she realized, for Nathaniel to see her, to look up from the accounts and the land surveys and the county politics and the dinner parties, and see not his wife, not his social partner, not the woman who managed the household with invisible efficiency, but her. Clara. The person. She had been waiting for that. For 6 years she had been waiting for that. And tonight she understood with the kind of certainty you only reach after a very long time that she had been waiting for something that required Nathaniel to be a different man than he was. She could not wait for a different man. She was married to this one. So she had to make a different choice. She did not know yet what that choice was, but she felt it forming somewhere underneath the clarity, the way ice forms under still water. Slow. Patient. Inevitable. She went to sleep. Kept at the eye. Nathaniel came to bed at 2 in the morning. She heard him the particular sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the soft click of the door, the sounds of a man who assumes he will not wake anyone because he has never had to think about whether he would. She lay still. He did not speak. She did not speak. He settled into his side of the bed, large, distant, an ocean of fine linen between them, and within minutes his breathing had slowed and deepened. She lay awake. She looked at the ceiling. She thought, "What is my name?" Not as a cry of despair, not as self-pity, as a genuine question, as an inventory. Who am I, Clara Elizabeth Whitmore, daughter of James and Margaret Whitmore of Charlottesville, 26 years old, born in August, afraid of thunderstorms, fond of lavender, able to read French and speak a little of it, good with numbers, better with people, happiest when there is something useful to do and someone grateful for the doing of it, a real person, with a name, with a history, with a self, and my husband forgot it. She exhaled. Beside her, Nathaniel slept, undisturbed. Morning. Clara was up before him. This was not unusual. She was always up before him. She went to the kitchen and spoke with Mrs. Boone about the day's meals. She reviewed the accounts that had arrived with yesterday's post. She walked the perimeter of the kitchen garden because the beans needed staking, and Thomas the gardener's boy had been unwell. She staked the beans herself in her morning dress in the already warm July air, with her hair pinned up and her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and Mrs. Boone watched from the kitchen door with an expression that had in it both admiration and a particular kind of sorrow. "Mrs. Ashford," Mrs. Boone called. "You don't need to do that yourself." "I know," Clara said. She staked 3 more beans. "Then why?" "Because it needs doing, and I am here," Clara said simply. "And because sometimes it is good to do something with your hands that shows you clearly what it is." Mrs. Boone was quiet for a moment. "You all right, ma'am?" Clara looked up from the beans. The morning light was coming low and gold over the garden fence. A cardinal had landed on the post at the corner. The air smelled like warm earth and green growing things, and the faint, distant sweetness of the honeysuckle that ran along the back wall. "I am figuring something out," she said, "but I think I will be fine." Nathaniel came downstairs at 9. He was dressed already. He had a meeting with his steward Callum Briggs about the hay production on the North Fields, and he moved through the breakfast room with the efficiency of a man who had many things to do and had mentally organized his day before his feet hit the floor. He sat. He picked up the paper. A servant brought his coffee. Clara came in from the garden still with dirt on her gloves and sat across from him. He looked up. "You were in the garden already?" "Yes." He looked back at his paper. "The beans again?" "Yes." Silence. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, 2 horses passed on the road. "Last night went well," Nathaniel said from behind his paper. Hayes was impressed. "Good," she said. "He'll recommend the Federal Survey team revisit the northern boundary question. That's been unresolved for 3 years." "I know," she said. "You told me in March." Another silence. He turned a page. "Clara?" "Yes." He lowered the paper slightly, looked at her over the edge of it. His eyes, gray-sharp, the color of river water, after rain, held the expression she had learned to recognize. Not guilt exactly. Not quite. Something in the neighborhood of guilt that was still maintaining a comfortable distance from it. "About last evening," he said. She waited. "I was—" He stopped, set the paper down, picked up his coffee. The conversation had been complex. Hayes asked a great many questions about the grant boundaries, and I was— "You didn't remember my name," she said. The words were not angry, they were simply true. She put them on the table between them, the way you put down a glass, carefully, deliberately, with no particular force. He looked at her. "I knew your name," he said. "You couldn't say it." "I knew it," he repeated, and there was something in his voice that was halfway between defensiveness and the beginning of something else. She looked at him. He was still holding his coffee cup. His hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. "Nathaniel," she said. "When is my birthday?" He blinked. She waited. The clock ticked. The cardinal outside gave one sharp note and went quiet. "August," he said finally. "It's in August." "What day?" He said nothing. "What do I read?" she asked. "Not what is on my shelf. What am I actually reading right now this summer?" "Nothing." "What did I have for breakfast on Monday?" "Nothing." "What did I say to you 2 weeks ago when I came to find you in the study after supper?" "What did I say?" He set down his cup. His jaw was tight. "I see," Clara said quietly. She stood. She smoothed her skirt. "I'm going into the village today," she said. "Mrs. Calloway's husband was wounded in the war, and she's been managing the farm alone. I'm bringing supplies." She moved toward the door. "Clara." She stopped, turned. He was looking at her. Really looking at her, or something close to it, the closest he had come in a long time. His expression was difficult to read. There was something there that might have been the first edge of understanding, or might have been nothing more than the irritation of a man whose orderly morning had been disrupted. She waited. He said nothing. She nodded once. She left. The ride to the village took 40 minutes on horseback. Clara went alone, which was unusual. Nathaniel had always maintained that a woman of her position required a male escort, a view she had historically deferred to because she had historically deferred to most of his views. But this morning, she simply saddled her own mare and rode. Nobody stopped her. Perhaps nobody noticed. The village of Ashford Crossing was small by most standards. A church, a mill, 3 streets of houses, a dry goods store, a blacksmith, a doctor's office. But Clara had always found it more alive than the grand rooms of the manor. People knew each other here, knew each other's names, knew each other's troubles. She tied her mare to the post outside the dry goods store and carried her basket to the Calloway house on the eastern edge of the village. Margaret Calloway was 43 and thin in the way of a woman who gave food to her children before she considered herself. She answered the door in a worn house dress with flour on her hands and the expression of a woman who had been surprised by kindness before and was not entirely sure how to receive it. "Mrs. Ashford." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I didn't expect—" "I should have come sooner," Clara said. "May I come in?" She stayed 2 hours. She left the basket flour, salt pork, a jar of preserves from the Ashford larder, a length of cloth that could be made into clothing for the 2 young Calloway boys. She helped Margaret mend a fence rail in the back that was close to falling. She listened while Margaret talked about her husband Thomas, who had come back from the war with the hearing mostly gone from his left ear and a slowness in his right hand that the doctor said might improve with time or might not. She listened. She did not offer advice. She did not manage the situation. She simply listened with the full attention of a woman who understood something about what it meant to speak into a silence. When she stood to leave, Margaret took her hands. "You're different than I thought," Margaret said. "Different how?" "Kinder." Margaret shook her head slightly. "I thought with your position, I thought you might be more—" She stopped, looked for a word. "Like my house," Clara offered gently. Margaret gave a short, surprised laugh. "I suppose so." Clara squeezed her hands. "I'll come back next week." She meant it. She had not meant to mean it. She had come with the basket because she had thought it was the right thing to do. But standing in Margaret Calloway's small kitchen, in the warm smell of bread and dust, and the faint, particular sadness of a family, holding itself together with great effort, she had felt something she had not felt in a long time. Useful. Not useful, the way she was useful at the manor, efficiently useful, invisibly useful. A mechanism of function, but useful in a way that another person could see and feel. She rode home with the empty basket and something new settling in her chest. Not happiness exactly, not yet. Something more like remembering. Okay. She began going back. Not every day. 3 times a week, then 4. She mapped her routes through the county, the way a general maps territory, not for conquest, but for understanding. She knew which families had lost men in the war. She knew which farms were struggling. She knew that old Reverend Hutchins' eyesight had gotten worse, and that his wife was managing the church records alone. She organized a sewing circle. 8 women meeting Tuesday afternoons in the church hall. They made shirts for the men who had come back with nothing. They made small things, cloth dolls, knitted socks for children in the families that had the least. They talked. Clara had not had women to talk to. Not really. Not in 6 years. The wives of Nathaniel's associates were pleasant enough, but those were social conversations, performances, really careful dances of politeness in which nothing true was said. These women in the church hall: Margaret Calloway, the blacksmith's wife; Ruth Greer, Dr. Carter's housekeeper; Mrs. Adeline Potts; young Patience Hale, whose husband had come back from the war a quieter man than he'd left. These women talked about real things, about loneliness, about the specific difficulty of loving someone who is present in body but absent in every other way, about what it meant to keep a household running, to keep children fed and washed and loved, to keep everything functioning smoothly, invisibly, endlessly, while the world credited the man whose name was on the deed. Clara listened. She talked. She said things she had not said to anyone. She felt herself for the first time in 6 years beginning to remember who she was outside the walls of Ashford Manor. She also met Dr. Samuel Carter. He had his practice on the main street of Ashford Crossing. He was 31, slight and fair-haired, with round spectacles and the permanently alert expression of a man whose mind was always moving a little faster than the conversation around him. He had trained in Philadelphia and come to Ashford County 3 years ago, and was by all accounts a very good physician and a very straightforward man. He was not in love with Clara. This is important to establish because the people of Ashford County, who noticed their friendship, were very quick to assume that he was. He was not. He was a man who recognized someone doing genuinely good work when he saw them, and he respected it. "Mrs. Ashford," he said the first time they properly spoke outside the Calloway house where he had come to check on Thomas's hand. "You've helped this family more in 3 weeks than the county assistant's office has managed in 3 months. "The county assistant's office is very busy," Clara said. "That's generous of you." He tilted his head. "Most people in your position wouldn't bother." "What position is that?" He considered. "Comfortable," he said finally. "Protected from the parts of life that are difficult." She looked at him for a moment. "You'd be surprised," she said, "what is difficult from inside a comfortable house." He looked back at her with the direct measuring attention of a man who takes people at face value. "Yes," he said. "I think I would be." He tipped his hat. He went in to see Thomas. She stood on the Calloway porch in the summer heat and felt something unfurl in her chest. Not romance. Nothing like romance, but the particular relief of being seen accurately. Of someone looking at her and understanding in a moment more than her husband had understood in 6 years. She was not angry. That was the thing people, if they had known, might not have understood. She was not angry at Nathaniel. Anger would have been easier in some ways. Anger has a clear target and a clear action. You point it at the thing, you let it propel you, you move. What Clara felt was sadder than anger. She felt the particular grief of something that has been lost so slowly you didn't notice it going. Not a door slamming. A door slightly open, swinging imperceptibly, degree by degree, until one day you look up and it is closed. She had loved Nathaniel when she married him. She remembered it. She remembered being 18 and meeting him at her father's table and thinking, "This is a serious man. A real man. A man who means what he says and builds what he plans." She had been attracted to his certainty, his solidity. The world felt more stable near him. She had loved him. She wasn't sure anymore when that had changed to something else. When love had shifted into duty, and duty into performance, and performance into the numb daily habit of a woman going through motions she could no longer feel. She thought it had happened the way the door had happened, slowly, imperceptibly, until she looked up. Nathaniel noticed. He was not whatever his failings a foolish man. And he was a man who liked his household in order, which meant he was a man who noticed when something in his household had changed. She was not where she had always been. That was the simplest way to put it. For 6 years, Clara had existed in a specific, predictable orbit around his life, available nearby. Always there when the domestic machinery required managing. He had grown accustomed to the fact of her the way you grow accustomed to a river running past your property. It is simply there, part of the landscape, reliable in its presence, even if you've stopped looking at it directly. Now she was elsewhere. 3 mornings a week she rode to the village. Some afternoons she was in the church hall. She came to dinner. She was present at breakfast. She managed the household as efficiently as ever. But there was a quality to her presence that had shifted. She was there and somewhere else at the same time. Her attention was directed outward, in a way he didn't recognize. He found himself twice going to her study to say something and finding it empty. He found himself once at dinner asking a question about the Callaway farm. He wasn't sure why he'd asked, perhaps because Briggs had mentioned it, and realizing that Clara knew more about the state of that farm and that family than he did. He found himself noticing that the servants spoke to her differently than they used to. Not deferentially, they had always been deferential because she was their employer's wife, but warmly. With the particular warmth you give to someone who has earned something from you, rather than simply been placed above you. Nathaniel sat with this. He was not accustomed to sitting with things that were uncomfortable, but he sat with this. The moment that broke something open in him came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the party. He had ridden into Ashford Crossing for a meeting with the land surveyor, and on his way back, he passed through the main street, and he saw Clara. She was standing outside the dry goods store with Dr. Carter and 2 women he half recognized, the blacksmith's wife and someone else, and she was laughing. He almost didn't recognize her, not because she looked different. She looked exactly as she always looked, the blue dress, the careful posture, the chestnut hair. But the laugh was different. It was not the small, polished, socially appropriate smile he was accustomed to seeing on her face. It was an unguarded laugh, full and genuine, the laugh of a woman who has forgotten for a moment to be careful. He pulled his horse to a stop. She had not seen him. Dr. Carter said something Nathaniel couldn't hear from this distance, and Clara laughed again and shook her head and replied, and Carter grinned, and the blacksmith's wife covered her mouth to hold in her own laughter. Nathaniel watched. He felt something he did not immediately have a name for. He turned his horse and rode home. He sat in his study for a long time, and gradually, slowly, with the painful precision of a man who is not accustomed to being wrong about anything, the thing he was feeling revealed itself. It was not jealousy exactly. It was the recognition of a deficit, the sudden clarifying awareness of an absence you have created without meaning to. Another man knew what made Clara laugh. A real laugh, not a performance. He, her husband, did not. He had not tried to. For 6 years he had been the most important man in the county, and he had not once in 6 years tried to make his wife laugh. He sat with that for a long time too. Yad. He went to find her. She was in the small sitting room off the hallway near the window with a piece of mending in her hands and a book open on the table beside her. Not reading. Just present in herself. Quiet in a way that was not the absence of anything but the presence of a specific kind of contentment. She looked up when he came in. "Nathaniel?" "What are you reading?" he asked. She blinked. "I'm sorry." "The book." He gestured. "What is it?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the book and showed him the cover. He read the title. A collection of essays on agricultural improvement in the southern states. "I didn't know you were interested in that," he said. "You never asked." The words were simple. No edge on them. Just the truth. He stood in the doorway. He thought about 6 years of asking things about the household, about dinner, about social obligations. He thought about how many times in 6 years he had asked her a question about herself. Her reading, her thoughts, her dreams. He could not think of one. "Clara," he said. "Yes. What is it that you—" He stopped. He was not good at this. He was good at boardrooms and surveys and negotiating land boundaries, but he was not good at this. The work you've been doing in the village, is it? He stopped again. She watched him. He took a breath. Is it what you want? He asked. Is that where you want to be spending your time? She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said quietly. It is. Those women, those families, they need things I can give. And when I am there, I remember things I had forgotten. What things? Who I am, she said. When I'm not here. The sitting room was quiet. The summer evening was coming in through the open window, warm and gold, with the sounds of crickets starting up in the fields. Nathaniel looked at his wife. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything, but for the first time in a very long time, perhaps the first time ever, he was in the room with her. Not moving past her, not looking through her. Actually there. She saw him notice it, saw something in his expression shift. She didn't allow herself to hope. She was not, in this particular summer of 1817, in the business of hope. She was in the business of something steadier, but she let him stand there. She let him stay. That night she wrote in her journal a thing she had not done in years. She wrote, "He asked what I was reading. He stood in the doorway and asked what I was reading. I do not know what that means. I do not know if it means anything at all, but I know that I answered him. I told him the truth. And he stood there and listened. I have been invisible for a very long time. Tonight I think he almost saw me. I am not ready to forgive him, but I am watching." A woman learns to be careful with the shape of what she hopes for. But she never entirely loses the capacity to hope. Not even after 6 years. Not entirely. She closed the journal. Outside the window of Ashford Manor, the Virginia summer lay still and warm and full of fireflies, rising like small questions into the dark. And Clara Whitmore Ashford, who had been waiting for 6 years, made herself a quiet, firm, unshakable promise. She was not going to wait anymore, but she was going to watch. And if what she saw was real, if the man she had once glimpsed behind the power and the pride was still somewhere in there, still capable of finding his way to her, then she would be present when he arrived. And if not, she would be fine. She already was. The morning after Nathaniel stood in the doorway and asked what she was reading, he did not mention it at breakfast. He came down at 8, picked up his paper, drank his coffee, exchanged 4 sentences with Callum Briggs about the Northfield drainage, and left for his study without looking at her once. Clara watched him go. She poured herself more coffee. She was not surprised. She was also not crushed. That was the difference. That was the specific, quiet difference between the woman who had sat at this same table 6 months ago and the woman sitting here now. 6 months ago, that silence would have been a wound. She would have spent the morning analyzing it, searching for what she had done wrong, constructing elaborate explanations for why her husband could not manage a single direct look before 9 in the morning. Now, she simply finished her coffee, set down the cup, and went to prepare for her Tuesday visit to the sewing circle. She was not waiting for Nathaniel Ashford to decide to notice her. She was already somewhere else. The sewing circle had grown. What had begun as 8 women in the church hall had become 11, then 14. Ruth Greer had brought her sister-in-law from the next county. Patience Hale had mentioned it to a neighbor who mentioned it to someone else, and now there were women walking sometimes 40 minutes to sit in that warm hall on Tuesday afternoons and sew shirts for men who needed them and talk about things they didn't say anywhere else. Clara drove the wagon herself these days. She had stopped asking for the formal carriage, stopped requesting the escort Nathaniel had once insisted upon. She had simply quietly begun moving through her own days as though they belonged to her. Because they did. When she came into the hall that Tuesday, Margaret Calloway was already there, thread in hand, and the expression on her face when she saw Clara come through the door was not deferential. It was warm. It was the expression of a woman who is genuinely glad to see someone without complication. "You're early," Margaret said. "Thomas had a good week," Clara said, tying her bonnet strings at her neck and hanging it on the hook by the door. It wasn't a question. She already knew. She had stopped by the Calloway farm on her way. "He lifted the plow handle yesterday," Margaret said, and the pride in her voice was enormous, the kind of pride that lives right next to the memory of being afraid. Whole grip, both hands. I know. Clara sat down and picked up her needle. He showed me this morning, 3 times. Margaret laughed. He would, she said. Lord, that man. The other women filtered in. Ruth Greer, broad-shouldered and efficient, who could hem a collar in the time it took most women to thread a needle. Young Patience Hale, who was 22 and had a baby on her hip and an expression of permanent, careful exhaustion. Mrs. Adeline Potts, who was 60 and had been sewing since she was 7 and had opinions about thread tension that she shared freely and at length. And Dr. Carter came by, as he sometimes did, to drop off a list of the families in the county who most needed assistance that week, a task he had begun assigning himself because, as he had told Clara the 3rd time, he appeared with such a list. You actually do something with the information, which is more than I can say for the county board. 3 families on Foster Road, he said, handing her the folded paper. The oldest Pemberton boy is malnourished. I've seen him twice this month. And there's a widow on the eastern edge, Mrs. Anne-Marie Dodd, who has 5 children and a broken well casing. I can be there Thursday, Clara said, looking at the list. I thought you might say that. He paused. The well casing is going to take real work, someone with tools. I'll ask Thomas Calloway if his hand is strong enough to manage a wrench. She looked up. If not, I'll ask Mr. Greer. Carter looked at her with that expression she had come to recognize, not admiration, exactly more like someone watching a complicated mechanism operate smoothly and finding satisfaction in the precision of it. You know, he said 6 months ago half these families had never set foot on Ashford property except to pay rent. I know, Clara said. And now they talk about you. He paused. How do they talk about me? He tilted his head. Like you're one of them. Clara looked at him. I am one of them, she said. He nodded once. Yes, he said. That's exactly it. He put his hat back on and walked out into the Tuesday sunshine. Across the room, Ruth Greer watched him go, and then looked at Clara with an expression that contained a very specific kind of knowing. He's a good man, Ruth said carefully. He is, Clara agreed. Useful? Very. Ruth said nothing else. But the corner of her mouth did something that Clara chose to ignore. She was not interested in rumors. She was especially not interested in rumors because she knew that in a county this size, everything anyone did was observed by someone and interpreted by 3 others. And the idea that a married woman could work alongside a male physician for the betterment of the community without anyone leaping to conclusions was apparently too straightforward to be believed. She set it aside. She had more important things. The well on Foster Road wasn't going to fix itself. What happened 3 days later, the Thursday she had marked in her mind as the day for Foster Road, was not on any list she had made. It started simply. She was loading the wagon outside the manor, a coil of rope, a set of iron tools borrowed from the Greer blacksmith shop, 2 baskets of food for the Pemberton family, when she heard the front door of the manor open. She did not turn around. She assumed it was Mrs. Boone, with the last of the food parcels. Where are you going? It was Nathaniel's voice. She turned. He was standing at the top of the front steps in his riding clothes, as though he had been about to go somewhere himself, and had instead found himself arrested by the sight of his wife loading a wagon with rope and iron tools. Foster Road, she said. There's a widow with 5 children and a broken well casing, and a family where the children aren't eating enough. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the rope. Who is going with you? Thomas Calloway. His hand is strong enough now, and Ruth Greer offered her son. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. That's a 3-hour ride. 2.5 if the road's dry. Another silence. I could... He stopped. She waited. He looked at the wagon again. Something was working in his expression that she recognized from the doorway 3 days ago, that same careful, uncomfortable quality of a man trying to navigate something he hasn't learned yet. I could send Briggs, he said finally. He knows well casings. I have Thomas, she said, and the Greer boy. We'll manage. Clara. Nathaniel. She kept her voice even. This is what I do on Thursdays. I've been doing it for months. We manage fine. He stood there. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins, looked down at him. He looked back up at her. And the expression on his face in that moment, she would remember it for a long time. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. Because what was on his face was very simple and very unguarded, which was unusual for a man who guarded himself like a treaty. He looked like a man who had just understood something that should have been obvious a long time ago. She clicked her tongue to the horse. The wagon moved. She did not look back, but she was aware the whole length of the drive of the feeling of his eyes on the road behind her. It was raining slightly by the time they reached Foster Road. A thin Virginia rain that didn't commit to anything, just enough to make the road soft and the work harder. Thomas Calloway arrived with his tools and his slow, careful movements, and the deep, quiet dignity of a man rebuilding himself, one lifted object at a time. The Greer boy, James 18, with the enormous hands of his father's trade, set to the well casing with the focused energy of someone who finds physical problems easier than social ones. Clara went to the house. Mrs. Anne-Marie Dodd was 37, but looked older in the particular way of women who have held more than their share of weight for more than their share of years. She opened the door and looked at Clara with the expression of someone who has learned to distrust kindness because it usually comes with conditions attached. "Mrs. Ashford," she said. "Mrs. Dodd." Clara held up one of the baskets. "May I come in?" The kitchen was dim and clean, fiercely clean. The kind of clean that is a form of dignity maintained against difficulty. 5 children at various stages of work and play, the oldest a girl of perhaps 12, who looked up from the bread she was kneading with her mother's same careful, watchful eyes. Clara set down the basket. She didn't make a speech. She didn't explain her charitable intentions or reference her position or say anything about the Ashford estate's commitment to community welfare. She had learned in these months of Thursday visits and Tuesday afternoons that the quickest way to make someone feel seen was to simply do what was needed without making them watch you feel good about doing it. She sat down across from the youngest child, a boy of perhaps 3, wide-eyed and serious, and said, "What is your name?" "Edmund," the boy said carefully. "Edmund is a fine name," she said. "My grandfather was named Edmund." The boy considered this information solemnly. Then he climbed down from his chair and came and stood next to her with the absolute confidence of a 3-year-old who has decided you are acceptable. Mrs. Dodd watched this. Then, very quietly, she sat down and put her hands in her lap and said, "It's been a hard summer, Mrs. Ashford." "I know," Clara said. "Tell me." She stayed 4 hours. By the time she left, the well casing was repaired. Edmund had shown her his collection of interesting rocks, and Mrs. Dodd had spoken more freely than she had spoken to anyone outside her children in, by her own reckoning, 2 years. Thomas Calloway and James Greer were loading the tools back in the wagon when she came out of the house. Thomas took one look at her face and said nothing. James Greer, who was 18 and therefore still believed that silence was just the absence of words, said, "Everything all right, ma'am?" "Yes," Clara said. She climbed back onto the wagon. "She looked better when you came out than when you went in," Thomas said. "She needed someone to listen," Clara said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Seems like most people need that." "Yes," Clara said. "They do." The wagon rolled back toward Ashford. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel changed in small ways that she was not sure he noticed himself. He began coming downstairs earlier. Not dramatically earlier, not declaring any new schedule or making announcements, just showing up at the breakfast table at 8 instead of 9 or 8:30 and sitting there with his coffee. Not always talking, but present, choosing to be in the same room at the same time. One morning, he asked about Mrs. Dodd. Clara was so startled by the question that she paused with her cup halfway to her mouth. "She's managing better," Clara said when she had recovered her composure. "The well is fixed. Her daughter has started selling embroidery through the dry goods store. I arranged it with Mr. Harkin. She'll make enough to supplement the household through winter." Nathaniel looked at his coffee. "You arranged that?" Yes, Harkin agreed. He wasn't inclined to at first, Clara said evenly. I reminded him that I have significant influence over which dry goods establishment receives the Ashford household accounts. There was a pause. Did you threaten Harkin? Nathaniel asked, in a tone that was not quite amusement and not quite surprise. I informed him of relevant facts and allowed him to draw his own conclusions, Clara said. This time the pause was longer, and then quietly, with the particular reluctance of a man who doesn't do it often. Nathaniel Ashford smiled. It was not a large smile. It was barely a smile at all. Really a slight softening at the corner of his mouth, a brief thing over quickly. But it was real. Clara looked at her plate. She was not going to read too much into a smile. She had been reading too much into insufficient gestures for 6 years. She was done with that particular habit. But she filed it away, because she was watching. The first real test came on a Tuesday 3 weeks later. She came home from the sewing circle to find Victoria Caldwell in her sitting room. Victoria Caldwell was 29, and the daughter of old Thomas Caldwell, whose money was older than anyone's in the county, and who had made sure Victoria grew up aware of this at every possible moment. She was beautiful in the particular deliberate way of a woman who has always been rewarded for her appearance and has therefore learned to weaponize it. She wore a pale green dress that probably cost more than the entire Dodd household would earn in a year. And she was sitting in Clara's chair. Clara's particular chair, the one by the window, as though she had always sat there, and always would. "Clara," she said when Clara came in. "What a surprise." "Is it?" Clara asked pleasantly. She removed her bonnet. She sat in the chair by the fireplace, not her preferred chair, but a chair, and therefore not a surrender, just a minor territorial concession she was willing to make on a Tuesday. "Nathaniel is in his study, I believe." "Oh, I didn't come to see Nathaniel." Victoria smiled. "I came to see you." The air in the room did a thing. Clara looked at her. "I heard something," Victoria said, arranging herself in the chair with the ease of a cat. "About your Thursday visits." "Did you?" "And the sewing circle." "Word travels." "It does." Victoria tilted her head. "I wanted to make sure you were aware of something as a friend." The word friend carried the same relationship to its actual meaning as a drawn pistol carries to a handshake. "I appreciate that," Clara said. "People are talking." Victoria lowered her voice to a register that conveyed both concern and the pure pleasure of delivering information. "About you and Dr. Carter. I know it's nothing, of course I know that, but you understand how these things look. A married woman of your position spending time with a young physician unchaperoned." "I am accompanied by Thomas Calloway and often by Ruth Greer's son," Clara said. "A farmhand and a boy," Victoria said gently. "Not exactly a proper escort." Clara looked at her. Victoria looked back with an expression of pure, practiced solicitude. Clara said, "Victoria, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "When was the last time you visited a family on Foster Road?" Victoria blinked. "Or fixed a broken well?" Clara continued. "Or organized a supply drive for the families of wounded soldiers? Or sat in a widow's kitchen for 4 hours because she needed someone to talk to?" Victoria started. "Because I have done all of those things," Clara said quietly. "And I will keep doing them. And if the county wishes to spend its time discussing the propriety of a woman helping families in need, rather than the welfare of those families themselves, then I think the county needs to have a very serious conversation with its own priorities." She stood. She went to the door of the sitting room. She held it open. Victoria Caldwell sat in Clara's chair for exactly 3 more seconds. Then she rose, adjusted her skirts, with the crisp movement of a woman preserving her dignity, and moved toward the door. She stopped beside Clara. "You've changed," she said. "Have I?" Clara said. "You used to be very—" She searched for the word. "Careful." "I still am," Clara said. "I'm just more careful about what I'm careful for." Victoria looked at her for a long moment. Then she left. Clara closed the door. She stood in the empty sitting room. Her heart was beating fast, faster than she'd let on. She was not whatever impression she had given Victoria Caldwell without nerves. She was not some immovable force who dispensed quiet wisdom without trembling inside. She was a 26-year-old woman who had 6 months ago been invisible, and she had just asked Victoria Caldwell to leave her own house. She sat down. She breathed. She waited for the guilt to arrive, the old habitual guilt of a woman who had spent 6 years not wanting to cause trouble. It didn't come. What came instead was something she hadn't expected. Pride. Plain, clean, uncomplicated pride. She had said what was true. She had held her ground. She had not been angry, not been cruel, not made a scene. She had simply been herself and asked someone who was not acting in good faith to take her not good faith elsewhere. It was, she realized, the first time in 6 years she had defended herself in her own house. She was still sitting there, still breathing through the aftermath of her own small revolution, when the study door opened down the hall and she heard Nathaniel's footsteps. He stopped in the doorway of the sitting room. "Briggs told me Victoria Caldwell was here," he said. "She was." "Where is she now?" "Gone." He looked at her. "What happened?" Clara considered how to answer that. "She had concerns about my activities in the village," she said. "I addressed them." "How did you address them?" "I told her the truth." Nathaniel stood in the doorway in exactly the way he had stood in it 3 weeks ago, with that same careful, uncomfortable quality of a man learning to navigate terrain that didn't come with a map. "Victoria Caldwell doesn't take correction easily," he said finally. "No," Clara agreed. "She doesn't." "She'll talk. She already was talking. That's why she came." Another silence. Then Nathaniel said something she was not expecting. "Good," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and his expression was not apologetic, and it was not dramatic. It was simply direct. The directness of a man who has just decided something. "I should have—" He stopped. Tried again. "The things she was implying about you and Carter. Anyone who knows you knows that's—" He stopped again. "Do you know me?" Clara asked. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out of the same place that the Victoria confrontation had come from, that new, quiet, firm core of herself that she was learning to trust. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him. He looked at the window, at the floor, at his own hands briefly in the way of a man taking inventory of things he's not sure are in order. "No," he said finally. His voice was low. "Not the way I should." The room was very quiet. Clara's heart did something complicated. She said nothing. He looked up at her. "But I am—" He stopped for the 3rd time. She watched him choose his words with the careful deliberation of a man who does not often allow himself to be uncertain in front of another person. "I am beginning to see that I don't, and that matters to me, that it should matter to me." It was not an apology. It was not a declaration. It was barely a sentence. But it was true. She could hear that it was true. She nodded once, very carefully, as though they were both handling something fragile. "All right," she said. She picked up her sewing. He stood there another moment. Then he went back to his study. Clara set down her sewing and stared at the wall. She sat with what had just happened and deliberately did not make it larger than it was. She had spent too many years making small things larger than they were. She was not going to do that. What had happened was this. Her husband had said something true. Something he had never said before, and had left without asking anything in return. That was small. But small was how it started. Small was where everything real began. She picked up her sewing again. Her hands were not entirely steady. She let them not be. The following Sunday, something happened in church that Clara would later think of as the first moment the county understood that something had changed. Reverend Hutchins gave his sermon on the parable of the talents, which was a fine choice for a summer Sunday, and produced the kind of comfortable nodding that good sermons in comfortable churches reliably produced. Afterward in the yard, while the congregation gathered in its usual configurations, men talking horses and land prices, women talking household and children, Margaret Calloway found Clara, and spoke to her about the Pemberton family on Foster Road, whose situation had improved markedly since Clara's intervention. This was not unusual. Clara had private conversations like this every week. What was unusual was that 3 other women joined the conversation. Then 2 more. Then old Mrs. Hutchins herself, the Reverend's nearly blind wife, who had never in 20 years of Sunday gatherings sought out anyone who was not already in her direct social circle. They were talking about the sewing circle, about the families, about the plans for the autumn supply drive. They were talking about practical things, who needed what, who could provide it, how to organize the effort. Clara was at the center of it, not because she had placed herself there, but because she had earned it. Nathaniel stood 20 feet away with the county surveyor and watched. She didn't know he was watching. She found out later from something he said, a fragment, not quite a full sentence, something about the yard after Sunday service that revealed he had been standing there and watching for the entire conversation. He said, "You know all their names." She had looked at him, not understanding at first. "In the yard after church," he said. "All of them. You knew every name." "Of course I did," she said. "The Pemberton children. You named all 4 of them." "There are 5 now?" she said. "Mrs. Pemberton is expecting again." He was quiet. "I know the names of the men in my business partnerships," he said slowly. "I know the names of every county official, every landowner within 40 miles, every federal representative I might need to know." A pause. "I don't know the names of the families on Foster Road." "No," she said. "You don't. Will you tell me?" She looked at him. He looked back. "Yes," she said. "If you want to know." "I want to know," he said. And so that evening after supper, for the first time in 6 years, Nathaniel Ashford and his wife sat together in the sitting room and talked about something that was not household accounts or social arrangements or the management of property. She told him about the Callaways, about Thomas's injury and his recovery, and the particular pride of a man relearning what his body could do, about Margaret's ferocious quiet love for her family. She told him about Mrs. Dodd and Edmund and the rock collection and the well casing, and how Harkin at the dry goods store had been reluctant until he wasn't. He listened. He asked questions, careful questions, the questions of a man who is new to a subject and knows it. At some point, Mrs. Boone brought in tea, and neither of them noticed for 10 minutes, which was the first time in Clara's memory that something as simple as hot tea had gone unnoticed in this house because they were too occupied with the conversation. Eventually, Nathaniel said, "I have 7 tenant farms on the North Road." "I know," Clara said. "I know the acreage of each one, the crop yields, the rental agreements." He paused. "I have never once been to any of them." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her. Not with guilt, he wasn't there yet, not fully, but with something that was the honest precursor to it, recognition. "You have," he said. "Yes. All 7. 5 so far. The other 2 I plan for October." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How did you know to do that? How did you know that was—" He stopped. "Nobody told you to do that." "No," she said. "Nobody told me." "Then why?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the night of the party, the portrait in the hallway, the journal she had begun keeping, the beans she had staked in the early morning. "Because I was looking for something to do that was real," she said. "And because those people are real. And because I had a great deal of energy that had no place to go." He looked at her. She met his eyes and held them. "I had a great deal of love," she said quietly, "that had no place to go." The sitting room was absolutely still. The evening was dark outside the window now, insects singing in the fields, one lamp burning between them, and Clara Whitmore. Ashford sat across from her husband and said the true thing, the thing she had never said. The thing that was so obvious and so devastating that she understood immediately from his expression it had landed exactly the way the truth always lands when it finally arrives, like a stone in still water, rings going outward. Nathaniel set down his teacup. He looked at the table. at the window, then back at her. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "I don't know how to—" He stopped. His jaw was tight in the way she recognized now as the expression not of coldness, but of a man holding something very carefully because he is afraid of dropping it. "I don't know how to be different than I've been." "I know," she said, "but I think I need to be." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then be," she said simply. It wasn't forgiveness. She was clear with herself about that. It was not the end of anything, and it was not the beginning of everything. It was one conversation on one evening in one sitting room, and the road between here and anything like what she deserved was long and would require more than words. But something had shifted, something real, and Clara Whitmore Ashford, who had stopped waiting, who had stopped begging to be seen, who had spent months building a life of her own that no one could take from her, looked at her husband and understood that watching sometimes means being present for the moment. Someone begins to wake up. She reached for her tea. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Outside, the Virginia night settled into the fields. The county around Ashford Manor went about its life, the Callaways and the Dodds and the Greers and all the named and unnamed people who made up the real texture of a place. The people who worked and worried and loved and kept going. And Clara sat in the lamplight and felt for the first time in a very long time that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. Not where she had been put, not where she had been left, where she had chosen. She set down her teacup. She picked up her sewing. And she let Nathaniel Ashford sit across from her in the room she had made her own, in the life she had built from the raw material of her own neglected self, and she did not ask anything of him. She only waited to see what he would do when nobody was asking. That she had learned was when you found out who someone really was. He started riding to the North Road on Wednesdays. Clara found out not because he told her, but because Thomas Calloway mentioned it. Thomas came by the manor on a Thursday morning with a repaired harness buckle he had borrowed, and while Clara was signing for the return of it at the kitchen door, Thomas said almost as an aside, "Your husband came by the Pemberton place day before yesterday." Clara's hand stopped moving on the paper. "Did he?" she said. "Stayed about an hour." Thomas's voice was carefully neutral in the way of a man who has learned to report facts without editorializing. "Walked the field with old Mr. Pemberton. Asked about the drainage on the East End." "The drainage?" Clara repeated. "Yes, ma'am." Thomas paused. "Mr. Pemberton said he'd never had a landlord ask about drainage before." Clara finished signing her name. She handed back the paper. She said, "Thank you, Thomas," in a voice that gave nothing away. After he left, she stood in the kitchen for a long moment with her hands flat on the table. She did not let herself make it mean everything. She had made that mistake too many times, taken a small thing, wrapped it in hope, and watched hope turn into expectation, and expectation turn into the particular agony of being disappointed by something you'd built yourself. She was done with that. But she allowed herself this, she noticed it. She placed it carefully in the part of her mind where she was keeping track of what was real, and she moved on with her day. What she did not expect was that he would ask her to come with him. It was a Tuesday. She was preparing the wagon for the sewing circle when Nathaniel came around the side of the house and said without preamble, "I'm going to the Hale farm this afternoon. James Hale wants to discuss the fence line on his southern border." A pause. "You know the Hales." She looked at him. "Patience is in my sewing circle." "Right." He was looking at the wagon, not at her. Hale mentioned that you'd helped them arrange supplies last winter." "I did. I thought you might—" He stopped, started again. "If you weren't busy." Clara looked at him for a long moment. This was new territory. In 6 years, Nathaniel had never once asked her to accompany him on business. She had attended social events. She had stood at his side at dinners. She had been present at gatherings where her presence was required as a function of her title. He had never asked her to come alongside him for something real. "Let me tell Ruth I'll be late," she said. He nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't make it into a moment. He simply accepted it and went to ready his horse. She stood by the wagon and breathed. She went to the Hale farm. James Hale was 28, thin, and had come back from the war with a quietness that patients had described to Clara as being like a door that used to open easily and now required real effort. He shook Nathaniel's hand and looked at Clara with a combination of surprise and something she recognized as the wary gratitude of a proud man who had accepted help and wasn't sure how to carry it. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. "Mr. Hale." She smiled. "How is your mother's knee?" He blinked. "Better, ma'am. Thank you for asking. Tell her the willow bark tea works better if you let it steep the full 10 minutes. Dr. Carter was very specific about that." "Yes, ma'am. I'll tell her." Something in him relaxed. Not completely, but noticeably the slight drop of a shoulder, the unclenching of a jaw. The small but real relaxation of a man who has understood that he is being spoken to as a person. Nathaniel watched this exchange. Clara didn't look at him, but she felt him watching. They walked the fence line. James Hale explained the dispute. An old boundary marker had shifted after the spring flooding, and his neighbor to the south, a man named Grady, was claiming 3 acres that Hale said were his by the original deed. Nathaniel listened with the focused, legal-grade attention he brought to everything that involved land and money, asking precise questions, taking mental notes. Clara walked beside them and listened. At some point, James Hale said, "The thing is, those 3 acres are where Patience grows the kitchen garden. If Grady takes them—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. Nathaniel started to say something about deed records. Clara said, "How long has she been growing that garden?" Hale looked at her. "Since we married. 5 years. And the neighbors know it? Everyone on this road knows it." "Then we have testimony," Clara said. "The deed dispute is about paper, but continuous use and community knowledge establishes a claim too. Dr. Carter's father practiced law before medicine. He might know someone in Richmond." Nathaniel was quiet. Hale looked at Clara with an expression that was no longer merely grateful. It was the expression of a man who has just seen someone solve in 30 seconds something he has been losing sleep over for months. "I didn't know that," he said. "I'll ask Dr. Carter Thursday," Clara said. On the ride home, Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. Not his old silence, the closed, impenetrable silence of a man who has decided the conversation is over. A different silence. A thinking silence. "You knew that," he said finally, "about continuous use." "My father dealt with a boundary dispute when I was 12, Clara said. "He talked about it at dinner for 6 months. I absorbed more land law than I ever intended to." Nathaniel was quiet again. "You solved that in 30 seconds, he said. "I had a head start," she said evenly. Another silence. "Clara." His voice was low, and there was something in it she had to work to identify because she heard it from him so rarely. "Why did you never—" He stopped. "Never what? Tell me what you knew. About any of it. The families, the county, the—" He gestured a small motion toward the road behind them. "You've been living in this county for 6 years. You know more about it than I do." "You never asked," she said simply. The words landed in the air between them. He did not argue with them. She had expected him to. She had been half-braced for it, the defensive pivot, the reframing, the subtle repositioning of blame. He didn't do it. He just rode in silence. And Clara thought that there might be more to this man than she had allowed herself to believe in a very long time. The first twist came on a Friday morning, and it came from the most unexpected direction. Clara was at the dry goods store, arranging the autumn supply collection she had enlisted Mr. Harkin, whose cooperation had become notably less reluctant since their conversation about the Ashford household accounts, when Victoria Caldwell walked in. Clara had seen Victoria twice since the sitting room confrontation, both times from a distance across a churchyard, with the mutual acknowledgement of 2 women who have said true things to each other and are still processing the aftermath. They had not spoken. Victoria came directly to her. "Clara," she said. Her voice was different, Not the carefully constructed warmth of 3 weeks ago. Something more stripped down. Victoria. Clara kept her hands on the crate she was sorting. What can I do for you? Nothing. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She looked at the supplies Clara was organizing: the blankets, the preserved food, the cloth. I heard what you said after I left. Clara looked up. I said it to you. I know. Victoria pressed her lips together. I told my father what you said, about the county's priorities, about the families on Foster Road. A pause. He agreed with you. Clara said nothing. He said... Victoria stopped. And in that stopping, Clara saw something she had not expected to see: a young woman behind the performance. A 29-year-old who had been raised to value status above everything and was beginning to have complicated feelings about that education. He said he hadn't thought about those families in years, that none of us had. Clara set down the blanket she was holding. What do you want, Victoria? She asked. Not unkindly, directly. I want to help, Victoria said. The words fell out of her like something she'd been holding for a while and had finally decided to put down. With the supply collection, she said. With the sewing circle. Whatever you need. She stopped again. I have time and I have money, and I've been spending both of them on things that don't matter, and I am... A long pause. I am tired of it. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Tuesday afternoons, Clara said. Church hall. Bring thread if you have it. We're always short on thread. Victoria exhaled. That's it. That's it. Victoria nodded once. Then she said almost too quietly, You're not going to make me earn it. You just did, Clara said simply. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to count blankets. Victoria left. Clara counted blankets, but her hands for a few moments were not entirely steady, because she understood what had just happened, and it was bigger than Victoria Caldwell's conversion of social conscience. What had happened was this: the story of what Clara was doing had traveled far enough and deep enough into the county that it was changing people she had never specifically intended to change. She was not just helping families on Foster Road. She was quietly, without drama or declaration, remaking the social fabric of Ashford County, one conversation at a time. She picked up the next blanket. She counted. She was going to need more thread. The crisis arrived on a Thursday afternoon in September, without any warning at all. Clara had gone to the Pemberton farm. The fifth child had arrived, a girl healthy and loud, to the enormous relief of Mrs. Pemberton, who had said during her last pregnancy that she hoped this one would be a fighter, and was on her way back when she heard the bell. Not the church bell. The other bell, the one on the east side of the village that the blacksmith rang for emergencies. 3 rings. Pause. 3 rings. She turned the wagon. She followed the sound. The Greer blacksmith shop was on fire. Not the building was fine. The men had gotten control of that quickly, but the timber store behind it had caught, and the timber store backed up against a row of 3 small houses where 4 families lived, and the wind was moving wrong. By the time Clara arrived, the village was already in organized chaos. Men forming a water line from the creek. Women pulling children and belongings out of the threatened houses. The noise of shouting and the smell of smoke, and underneath it all the sound of the creek water moving fast in its bucket-to-bucket journey toward the fire. Clara jumped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped. Where are the children? She called to the nearest person, who happened to be James Greer, his face already black with soot. First house all out, he said. Second house, Mrs. Marsh is inside. She wouldn't leave her. Which window? What? Which window is the front window of the second house? He pointed. Clara went. The front door of the second house was not on fire. The back of the house was the problem. The heat from the timber store was coming through the rear wall, and smoke had gotten inside before anyone realized the fire was moving in that direction. Clara pushed open the front door and went in. Mrs. Eleanor Marsh was 64 and had lived in that house for 31 years. She was standing in the center of her main room with a box of papers clutched to her chest. Marriage documents, Clara would later learn, and a letter from her son who had died in the war, and she was coughing. Mrs. Marsh, Clara crossed the room. "We need to go." "I have them," the old woman said, tightening her grip on the box. "I have them. I just need—" "You have them. They're in your hands." Clara took her arm. "Now we go." They went. Clara got Mrs. Marsh out the front door, and halfway across the road to where Dr. Carter had set up a makeshift station for checking on people she had not known he was there, until she saw him, and then she simply kept moving, kept guiding Mrs. Marsh toward him with the focused intentionality of a woman who has decided what needs to happen and is doing it. Carter took Mrs. Marsh from her. "Is there anyone else inside?" "Not that I saw." "Anyone unaccounted for?" "Check the Greer children. James said they were out, but I didn't see them myself." He nodded and shouted something to one of his assistants and moved. Clara turned back. The fire was under control by then. The water line had done its work, and the timber store had burned, but the houses behind it had held. The village was catching its breath. The particular shaken quiet of people who have come through something and are checking themselves to see if everyone is still there. She was standing in the road breathing smoke and summer air when someone came to stand beside her. She knew before she turned. She recognized the particular weight of that presence, the specific quality of air that came with it. Nathaniel. He was not in his riding clothes. He was in his work clothes, the plain coat, the dark trousers, and there was soot on his jaw, and his hands were wet from the bucket line. He had been there. In the water line. She had not seen him arrive. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. "She's with Carter. She'll be fine." He looked at her. His expression was something she had never seen on him before. Not the careful management of Nathaniel Ashford in public, not the uncomfortable half-present quality she had been watching him grow out of these past months. This was something rawer. "I saw you go in," he said. She looked at him. "The second house," he said. "I was on the water line and I saw you go in." She wouldn't leave. The back wall was... He stopped. His jaw was tight in a way that was not cold. The heat coming off that timber was... "I know," she said. "It was fine." "Clara." His voice broke slightly on her name, barely just a fracture quickly recovered, and she felt it like a hand placed on a bruise. Not painful, just exact. "It was not fine. It could have—" "But it didn't," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Something was happening in his face that she did not entirely have a name for. It was not simply fear, though, that was part of it. It was the expression of a man who has spent an hour on a water line thinking about what was happening in a house he couldn't get to, and who had arrived at conclusions during that hour that he had not possessed before it began. "I didn't know you did things like that," he said. She blinked. "Like what? Like—" He gestured at the second house at the road, at the whole scene around them. "Like go in." She thought about that. She thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, 1 year ago, 6 months ago. The careful woman, the quiet woman, the woman who had waited. "I didn't used to," she said honestly. He absorbed this. "What changed?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "I stopped waiting for someone else to do it," she said. The words fell between them and stayed there. Nathaniel Ashford stood in the road with soot on his jaw and wet hands and looked at his wife. Really looked at her the way she had been waiting 6 years for him to look at her, and she saw for the first time that he was genuinely afraid. Not of the fire, of what he'd almost not understood in time. That was when Victoria Caldwell appeared. She came through the crowd with a speed and directness that Clara would not have predicted 3 weeks ago. She had a blanket over her arm, and her fine green dress had soot on the hem, and she looked absolutely nothing like the calculated social weapon who had sat in Clara's chair in August. "Is everyone out?" she asked Clara, ignoring Nathaniel entirely. "Yes," Clara said. "Mrs. Marsh needs somewhere to stay tonight. The back of her house will need assessment before—" "She can come to us," Victoria said immediately. "We have the east wing empty. Tell her it's for as long as she needs." Clara looked at her. Victoria looked back. "I have thread," she added slightly stiffly. I brought it Tuesday. I know, Clara said. You did good work. Something crossed Victoria Caldwell's face that was not quite a smile, but was its immediate predecessor. She gave a short nod, turned, and went to find Mrs. Marsh. Nathaniel watched her go. Was that Victoria Caldwell? He asked. Yes. She's... He paused. Different. People can be... Clara said. He looked at her. She held his gaze. Clara, he said, and his voice was lower now. The public Nathaniel quality entirely gone, replaced by something that was simply a man's voice in a difficult moment. I need to say something and I don't... He stopped. I need to say something and I'm not going to say it well. Then say it badly, she said. He blinked. Then he said, I have been watching you for 3 months, since the morning after the party. I told myself I was noticing that I was paying attention, learning, understanding what I'd missed. He stopped. But today when I saw you walk into that house... He stopped again. She waited. I understood that I haven't been watching you, he said. I've been watching a version of you that I constructed so I could feel like I was doing something without having to change. A long pause. You walked into that house because that is who you are. Not who you became after I neglected you. Who you have always been. The road was quieting around them. People moving away, tending to the aftermath, carrying their relief and their exhaustion home with them. Mrs. Marsh's voice faint and stable from the direction of Dr. Carter's station. And I, Nathaniel said, never once in 6 years made any space for that person to exist inside my house. Clara's throat tightened. She looked at him, this complicated, difficult, proud man who was standing in a road with soot on his face, saying the truest thing he had ever said to her. And she felt something shift inside her that she had been holding very carefully in place for a very long time. Not forgiveness. She was clear with herself. Not yet. Not from one conversation in a road, but something. The beginning of believing he was capable of meaning it. That's true, she said quietly. I know. It's going to take more than knowing it, she said. I know that too. The silence between them was different from their old silences. The old ones had been empty, the silence of 2 people in the same space with nothing between them. This one had weight to it. It meant something. Nathaniel, she said. Yes. Do you know what I had for breakfast this morning? He looked at her, a beat. Then very carefully he said, Mrs. Boone made those corn cakes you like, the ones with the thyme. You had 2 of them and coffee, and you gave your 3rd one to Briggs's dog because she was sitting at the kitchen door. Clara stared at him. I've been paying attention, he said. For 3 months. I told you I was watching and I meant it. He looked away. I didn't understand until today what it was I was watching for. What were you watching for? She asked. He looked back at her. I was watching for you to need me, he said. And I finally understand. A long pause. You don't. You built a life that doesn't need me in it. And the only way I get to be part of it is if I earn it. Clara held very still. The words were exact. They were the exact words she would have written in her journal if she'd been trying to articulate what she needed from him. She did not know how he had found them. She wasn't sure it mattered. Yes, she said quietly. That's right. Then tell me how, he said. I don't know how. I'm not... He stopped. The jaw tightened. I'm not a man who asks for instruction, but I am asking. She looked at this man who had forgotten her name at his own party, who had slept beside her for 6 years without knowing her birthday, who had stood in the entrance hall of his own estate and accepted her help without offering her presence, who was standing in a road with soot on his face asking her to teach him. She said, "Come to Foster Road with me next Thursday." He blinked. That's it. That's the beginning, she said. Come to Foster Road, meet the Pembertons, meet Mrs. Dodd and Edmund, walk the land you own, and meet the people who live on it. A pause. Just come. All right, he said. And Nathaniel. Yes. Mrs. Pemberton's daughter is named Catherine. The youngest boy is William. They call him Will. She held his gaze. Remember that. He nodded slowly. Catherine, he said. And Will. Yes, she said. She turned toward her wagon. Behind her, she heard him say her name. Clara. She stopped. Turned. He was still standing in the road, and on his face was the expression she had seen once before, that unguarded, stripped-down look she'd caught at the party in the first terrible silence. The look of a man without his armor. I'm sorry, he said. For the party. He stopped. For before the party. For all of it. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about 6 years. She thought about the portrait in the hallway, and the journal she had started, and the beans she'd staked at dawn, and Mrs. Dodd's kitchen, and Edmund's rock collection, and Margaret Calloway's hands in hers, and the particular feeling of being seen after a long time of being invisible. She thought about the woman she had become in these months of finding her own way. She thought about whether that woman wanted to give this man another chance. She thought about what it would mean to choose him with her eyes open. She said, I know you are. She did not say it was all right, because it wasn't. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But she turned toward him just slightly, in a way that she had not turned toward him in 6 years, and she said, Thursday, Foster Road, 8 in the morning. Don't be late. He was not late. He arrived at the kitchen door at 7:50 in his plainest clothes hat in hand, with the particular quiet of a man who understands that he is beginning something and does not intend to waste it. Clara looked at him. She handed him a basket. The preserves are for Mrs. Dodd, she said. Don't drop them. He took the basket. They walked to the wagon together, and the county of Ashford, Virginia, the county that had watched Clara Whitmore. Ashford become visible, that had watched Nathaniel Ashford begin the long, uncomfortable process of becoming someone worth seeing, continued about its life, its 1,000 daily acts of survival and love and endurance, its families, with their broken wells and their kitchen gardens and their named and unnamed griefs. And 2 people drove a wagon down a dusty road in the September morning, not yet healed, not yet whole, but moving together, for the first time. The first Thursday went badly, not catastrophically, not in any way that an outside observer would have identified as failure. But Clara knew, and she suspected Nathaniel knew, that the morning on Foster Road had been harder than either of them had anticipated. It started well enough. Nathaniel carried the basket without dropping it. He remembered to remove his hat when they entered the Dodd house. He shook Edmund's hand with the grave seriousness the boy's dignity required. And when Edmund immediately presented him with a collection of rocks for inspection, Nathaniel looked at each one with what appeared to be genuine attention. This one's got gold in it, Edmund said, holding up a piece of quartz. Does it? Nathaniel said. Dr. Carter says probably not real gold, but possibly. Dr. Carter sounds like a careful man. He is, Edmund said approvingly. He always says probably. Clara watched this from across the room and felt something loosen in her chest. Then Mrs. Dodd came in from the back with flour on her hands and the expression she always wore when receiving visitors, that careful watching quality, the face of a woman who has been disappointed by people who meant well and is not yet ready to stop being careful about it. She looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at her. There was a long pause. Mrs. Dodd, Nathaniel said, I understand you've had the east well repaired. I have, she said evenly. I should have seen to that sooner. A pause. I didn't know it needed doing. No, she said. You didn't. Another pause. I know now, he said. Mrs. Dodd looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara quickly, a glance that said several things at once. Clara gave a very small nod. Sit down then, Mr. Ashford, Mrs. Dodd said. I'll get coffee. It was not warmth. But it was an opening, and Nathaniel took it without pushing further, which was exactly right. He sat. He drank the coffee. He asked about the children by name, Catherine, Will, and the others, and he got them slightly wrong on the first try, which actually helped more than getting them right would have, because Mrs. Dodd corrected him without ceremony, and something in the room relaxed from the correction. But on the Pemberton farm an hour later, it fell apart. Old Mr. Pemberton was 61, and had been farming Ashford land for 22 years. He had the weathered patience of a man who has made peace with things he cannot change, but underneath it was a core of pride that was not weathered at all. He met Nathaniel at the fence line hat in hand, with the particular posture of a tenant meeting his landlord, perfectly civil, entirely guarded. Nathaniel asked about the drainage. Pemberton answered. Nathaniel asked about the crop yield projections. Pemberton answered. Nathaniel asked about the fence dispute with the southern neighbor. And then he said, with the precise, efficient manner of a man accustomed to solving problems, "I can have Briggs draw up a corrected boundary survey. It should settle the question in a week." Pemberton was quiet. "Mr. Pemberton," Nathaniel said when the silence extended, "is that not satisfactory?" "It's very efficient, sir," Pemberton said carefully. "Then, I've been asking about that boundary for 4 years," Pemberton said. The words fell quietly, no anger in them, just fact. Nathaniel went still. "Through Briggs," Pemberton continued in the same quiet voice, "and through the county office, and once through a letter to the estate directly. 4 years. Clara stood very still. She had not known this. 4 years, Nathaniel repeated. "Yes, sir." The silence had a different quality now. It was not the comfortable silence of a problem being solved. It was the uncomfortable silence of a man understanding the size of something he had failed to see. "Mr. Pemberton," Nathaniel said. His voice was measured, but she could hear what was underneath it. "I did not know about those requests." "No, sir." "I am going to find out why not." "Yes, sir." A pause. "And I will have Briggs here by end of week," Nathaniel said. "Thank you, sir." On the wagon home, Nathaniel did not speak for the first 20 minutes. Clara let him be. She had learned in these months of watching him that his silences were not all the same. This one was the silence of a man going through something internally that was going to cost him something. Finally, he said, 4 years. "Yes," she said. "Those requests went through Briggs. Briggs should have—" He stopped. "I should have known. It is my land, my responsibility. It should not matter what Briggs—" He stopped again. "No," she said. "It shouldn't. I have been running this estate as a business," he said slowly. "Accounts and yields and boundary surveys. Numbers." A pause. "I never thought about who was living inside the numbers." "I know," she said. "You did, though." He turned to look at her. "You always did." "My mother ran a household with 30 tenants," Clara said. "She knew every family, every child. She said—" She paused, remembering. "She said that land without people is just dirt. The people are what make it worth having." Nathaniel was quiet. "I never met your mother," he said. "She died the year before we married," Clara said. "You know that." "I know," he said, "but I never asked about her." Clara looked at him. "No," she said. "You didn't." He turned back to the road. "Tell me," he said quietly. So she told him. In the space of a wagon ride on a dusty September road, she told him about her mother, Margaret Whitmore, who had been small and quick and had kept her household accounts in a green leather book, and could identify every person on her husband's land by name and ailment and aspiration. Who had told Clara that the most important thing a person with power could do was use it quietly, in service of people who had none. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. All the way home. When they arrived at the manor, he helped her down from the wagon, a small thing, the kind of ordinary courtesy he had rarely extended, and then stood holding the horse's bridle for a moment. "I want to go back," he said. She looked at him. "To Foster Road. Next week." He met her eyes. "All 7 farms eventually. I want to know what I own." "You mean who?" she said. A pause. Yes, he said. That's what I mean. He went to see Briggs that afternoon. Clara found out later from Mrs. Boone, who had heard it from the stable boy who had overheard it through the study window. Which was how news traveled at Ashford Manor, that the meeting between Nathaniel and his steward had been brief, and had involved Nathaniel placing 4 years of unanswered tenant requests on the desk and asking Callum Briggs to explain each one. Briggs had not been able to explain them to Nathaniel's satisfaction. Briggs was given a very clear set of new procedures. The stable boy reported that the study had been very quiet throughout, which was apparently more alarming than shouting would have been. Clara did not comment on this when Nathaniel came to dinner, but she noticed that he sat differently that evening. Not with less authority, he would always carry himself with a certain authority, and she had stopped expecting that to change or wanting it to, but with less distance, as though some of the glass he'd been standing behind for years had quietly come down. He asked about the sewing circle. She told him about the new supply arrangement with the Caldwell estate. Victoria had convinced her father to contribute winter blankets. He looked surprised. Thomas Caldwell. Victoria, Clara said. She asked him, and he agreed. Apparently she can be very persuasive when she's actually trying. The corner of his mouth moved. I know, he said. She's been persuading me to do things for years. A pause. Usually things that benefited Victoria. People can change what they work toward, Clara said. He looked at her. She looked back. Yes, he said. They can. The real twist, the one that broke something open so wide that nothing could go back to exactly how it had been happened on a Wednesday in October. And it had nothing to do with Foster Road or sewing circles or boundary surveys. It happened in the study. Clara had gone in to return a book she'd borrowed from Nathaniel's shelves. She had started doing this quietly, taking and returning books, a small, unauthorized use of his space that he had never commented on either way. She had assumed he hadn't noticed. The study was empty when she went in, which was unusual for a Wednesday afternoon. She was replacing the book when she saw the ledger on his desk. Not the estate accounts ledger. A different one, smaller. Leather-bound, newer. She should not have looked. She knew she should not have looked. She looked. It was his handwriting. Dense, precise, the handwriting of a man who had been trained to record everything with accuracy. The first entry was dated the day after the party in July. It said Clara's name. Clara Elizabeth Whitmore Ashford. Birthday August 14th, age 26. Her hand went to her mouth. She turned the page. Clara's mother, Margaret Whitmore, died 1811. Clara does not talk about her, but goes quiet in a particular way when her name comes up. Ask about her when the time is right. She turned another page. Clara reads agricultural essays and finds them genuinely interesting, not for show. She is better at accounting than she lets on. She can speak conversational French. She is afraid of thunderstorms, but does not mention it. She gave away her third corn cake on September 4th. She turned another page. Clara went into a burning house on September 17th. She went in without hesitating. I was on the waterline and I watched her go in, and I have never in my life been so afraid of something I could not control. Note to self, she has been doing things like this for months and you were not watching. You were never watching. That is the thing you have to fix. That is the only thing that matters. Clara closed the ledger. She put it back exactly where she had found it. She stood in the empty study for a moment with her hand still on the cover. Then she walked out. She went to the kitchen and helped Mrs. Boone with the afternoon bread, which she had never done before, and which Mrs. Boone accepted with the gracious non-reaction of a woman who has served in a complicated household long enough to take the unexpected in stride. She needed bread. She did not think about the ledger. She thought about the ledger. She thought about a man who had forgotten her name in July, sitting down the next morning and writing it carefully in a book. Who had been writing things in that book ever since. Who had been in his own precise and private way learning her. Not perfectly, not fast enough, not for long enough, and the years before the learning still existed and still mattered and were not erased by a ledger. She was clear about that. But he had been trying, not because anyone was watching, not because she'd asked him to. In the privacy of his study with no audience, he had been trying. She folded the bread. She breathed. She thought, "What do you do with that?" She thought, "What do you do when the man you had given up on turns out to be trying?" She did not have a simple answer, but she thought that the answer probably started with telling the truth. She found him that evening at the fence line of the east pasture, where he had taken to going when he needed to think. She had noticed this habit the same way she had been noticing all his habits these past months, assembling them the way he was assembling knowledge of her in small, careful pieces. "Nathaniel," she said. He turned. "I went into your study today," she said, "to return your book." He was still. "I saw the ledger," she said. Something moved across his face. Not embarrassment exactly, something more complex. The expression of a man who has been found out in something he would rather have remained private, but cannot in honesty regret. "Clara." "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. He looked at the fence line, then back at her. "Because I wasn't sure it was enough," he said. "And I wasn't sure I deserved." He stopped. "I didn't want you to feel like it was a bargaining tool, something I was offering in exchange for what? For you to stay," he said quietly. "I didn't want it to be a transaction." She looked at him. "It's not a transaction," she said. "I know." "Then why?" "Because I've spent my whole life turning things into transactions," he said. "Business, land, people's loyalty, everything has been managed, calculated." He looked at her directly. "You are the first thing in my life that I don't know how to manage, and I don't want to. I want to—" He stopped, tried again. "I want to get it right. I want to know you right. Not because it benefits me, because you—" He stopped a third time, and in the stopping, she heard how hard this was for him, how truly unfamiliar, and that unfamiliarity was its own form of honesty. "You deserve to be known," he said finally, "and I am trying to deserve to be the one who knows you." Clara looked at her husband. She thought about 18-year-old Clara, who had sat across from this man at her father's table, and thought serious, real, certain. She thought about 26-year-old Clara, who had stood in front of a portrait in a hallway and whispered into the dark. She thought about the woman she was now standing in a field she had learned to love, because the people on it were worth knowing, and she thought about what it meant to choose something, to choose it with full knowledge of its difficulty. To say, "I am choosing this, not because it's easy, but because I can see what it could become." "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "My mother's birthday was March 3rd, she said. She kept her accounts in a green leather book. She made the best apple butter you've ever tasted, and she never once told anyone her recipe, not even me." A pause. "She would have liked you better than you deserved. She liked people who were capable of more than they were currently doing." He was very still. "She sounds like someone else I know," he said quietly. "Don't push it," Clara said. He almost smiled. "No, I won't." She looked at the evening coming down over the field, warm and slow. She looked at this man beside her, who was not fixed, not healed, not transformed, who was somewhere in the long, difficult middle of becoming something better than he'd been. And she thought about what love actually was. Not what she'd believed it was at 18. Not the certainty, not the solidity. Something harder and more interesting than that. The choice to stay present while something was still becoming. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Tell me." "I am not the same woman I was when we married," she said. "The woman who waited for you to look at her, she is gone. I don't regret her, but I'm not her anymore." She turned to look at him squarely. "The woman I am now has her own life, her own work, her own people. That is not going to change because you've started keeping a ledger." "I know," he said. "I need you to not just know it," she said. "I need you to want it, to want me to be who I am, not a quieter version of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I watched you walk into a burning house," he said. "I watched you convince Thomas Caldwell's daughter to carry blankets to families she'd never spoken to. I watched you stand in a road outside a blacksmith shop and direct the entire recovery effort before anyone had thought to ask you to. A pause. I don't want a quieter version of that. I would not know what to do with a quieter version of that. Good, she said. She started walking back toward the house. Clara? She turned. He was still at the fence line, and the last of the evening light was behind him, and he looked for the first time in 6 years like a man who knew where he was standing. August 14th, he said. She blinked. Your birthday, he said. It's next month. She looked at him. I know I've missed them, he said. All of them. I know I can't. He stopped. I'm not asking for credit. I just wanted you to know that I know it. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then know this too, she said. You have from now until August 14th to show me that the man in that ledger is the man you actually intend to be. That's 3 months, he said. Yes. What if 3 months isn't enough? She allowed herself for the first time in a very long time the small luxury of something that was almost a smile. Then you start over on the 15th, she said. She walked back to the house. Behind her, she heard him exhale. What followed was not a transformation. She was determined to be honest about that with herself and with anyone who might have observed it. He did not become a different man. He became a better version of the one he already was, which is harder and more real and takes longer and shows in smaller, less dramatic ways. He came to Foster Road on Thursdays. Not every Thursday, but most of them. He learned the names. Not perfectly, he mixed up the Pemberton children twice, but he tried, and when he was corrected, he wrote it down, and he did not mix it up a third time. He sat in the sitting room in the evenings, not always talking, not always needing to fill the space with words, but present. There, choosing to be in the room. He told Briggs to bring all tenant requests to his desk directly. The second week of October, he rode to the county board and submitted a formal petition for the reconstruction of the Foster Road well casing that had failed again after Clara's repair. The original materials had been poor quality, and Nathaniel had taken one look at Dr. Carter's assessment and gone to the county board the following morning. Dr. Carter told Clara about it Thursday. He was in there 45 minutes, Carter said, in the tone of a man reporting a mildly surprising medical outcome. When he came out, the board had agreed to replace all 3 compromised well casings on Foster Road. County funded. Clara set down her needle. All 3. He apparently mentioned the legal implications of allowing known infrastructure failures on occupied tenant land. Carter's expression was measured, but the corners of his eyes were doing something. And also made a personal contribution to cover the difference between what the county would fund and what the job actually costs. Clara said nothing. He didn't tell you, Carter said. It wasn't a question. No, she said. He told me not to, Carter said. He paused. He said he wasn't doing it so that anyone would tell you. He was doing it because it needed doing. Clara picked up her needle. Her hands were not entirely steady. Well, she said. Yes, Carter said. Quite. He was good enough not to say anything else. But the following Tuesday, when Victoria Caldwell arrived at the sewing circle with extra thread and a slightly less careful expression on her face, she sat down across from Clara and said, My father heard about the Foster Road wells. Did he? Clara said. He's thinking about the infrastructure on his tenant farms. Victoria began threading her needle with the focused precision she'd developed over these months of Tuesdays. He wants to know if you'd be willing to advise him. Clara looked up. Victoria looked back. I told him you were busy. He said to ask anyway. Tell him Thursday afternoon, Clara said. After 2. Victoria nodded. She said nothing else. But when she left that afternoon, she touched Clara's arm briefly at the door. Just a touch. A small thing. The kind of contact that carries more than it costs, and Clara understood that some changes were happening at a scale she hadn't been tracking. She had set out to help families on Foster Road. She had ended up changing the way the county worked, not through a single dramatic act, but through the accumulated weight of 100 small ones. Her mother would have understood this. She was still thinking about this when Nathaniel came to find her that evening, and the look on his face when he came through the door of the sitting room was the look she had been watching for without quite admitting she was watching for it. Not the look of a man managing something. Not the look of a man performing improvement. The look of a man who has somewhere he genuinely wants to be. "I heard from Thomas Caldwell today," he said, sitting across from her. "About the infrastructure survey," she said. He paused. "Carter told you." "Victoria did." He absorbed this. "You knew about the wells." "I know about the wells," she confirmed. He looked at her. She looked back. They stayed like that for a moment, two people who were learning the specific language of each other, the difference between what was said and what was understood, the geography of what could be left unspoken, because it didn't need to be spoken. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Clara, I know you didn't do it for me," she said. "That's why I'm thanking you, because you did it because it was right, and that is—" She stopped. "That is different." He was quiet. "I also spoke to a solicitor in Richmond," he said, "about the Hale boundary dispute. Carter's father gave me a name." "Carter's father," she repeated. "When did you speak to Dr. Carter's father?" "Last week. I rode to Richmond." He paused. "He was very helpful. He also told me—" He stopped. "He said you reminded him of your mother." Clara went still. "He knew her?" she asked. "He practiced law in Charlottesville before he retired. He said your mother came to him once about a tenant dispute on your father's property." He looked at her. He said she sat down across from him and explained the entire situation in 10 minutes and then told him exactly what she needed him to do. He said it was the most efficient client meeting he'd ever had. Clara's throat was tight. He said, Nathaniel continued carefully, that she was the most competent person in any room she was ever in, and that the rooms rarely seemed to know it. Clara looked at the window. "She would have hated that about rooms," she said finally. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "She sounds like she would have." A pause. "Tell me more about her," he said, and so she did. She talked about her mother for the better part of an hour. Nathaniel listened the same way he had listened on the wagon road, with the full focused attention he usually reserved for things he considered important. She talked about the green leather book and the apple butter, and the way her mother could walk into a room of frightened people and make everything immediately more manageable simply by being steady. She talked about the last year when her mother had been ill and still kept the household accounts from her bed, writing in the green book with an increasingly shaky hand, and how Clara had taken over gradually, not because she was asked to, but because the work needed doing. "That's where you learned it," he said. "All of it. The accounts, the tenants, the everything," she said. "Yes." "I didn't know," he said. "No," she said. "You didn't." "I should have asked." "On the first day," she said. "You should have asked on the first day." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I should have." She looked at him. Something had been building in her for weeks. Not hope exactly, because she had made herself careful about hope. Something more like the moment before you open a door, when you still don't know what's behind it, and you are choosing to open it anyway. Not because you're certain of what you'll find. Because you've decided the finding out is worth the risk. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "I've been keeping something from you." He went still. "Not something bad," she said quickly. "Something I've been thinking about the separate home." His expression changed. She watched it change. "I arranged it in July," she said. "The Whitmore house in Charlottesville. I had it prepared. She paused. "I was preparing to leave. Not to cause a scandal. Just to—" She chose her words carefully. "To have somewhere to be if it turned out that this—" She gestured between them. "If it turned out that nothing here was going to change." The room was very quiet. "I know," he said. She blinked. "You know, Briggs told me, in August." His voice was even. "He found out from the Charlottesville property manager. You knew, she said slowly. Since August. Yes. And you didn't? What was I going to do? He said quietly. Forbid you. You had every right. He looked at her directly. You still do. She looked at him. Do you understand what that arrangement means to me? She asked. I think so. Tell me what you think it means. He was quiet for a moment, thinking, not stalling. It means you are here because you choose to be, he said. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because leaving would cost you something you can't afford. He held her eyes. You can leave. And you stay. And every day you stay is a choice you make. A pause. And I cannot take that for granted. I cannot ever again take that for granted. Clara sat with that. She thought about the portrait in the hallway. She thought about the journal entry from July. She thought about 6 years of waiting and 3 months of watching and everything in between. She thought about what her mother had said once when she was 12 years old and had asked how you knew when something was worth keeping. Her mother had said, you know when losing it would cost you more than the keeping costs you. The house in Charlottesville, Clara said. Yes, I'm not going to close it, she said. I want you to understand that. He nodded. All right. I'm not going to close it, she said, because I need it to exist, not because I'm planning to leave, but because I need to know that I'm here by choice. I understand, he said. She believed him. That was new. That was its own small miracle. She looked at her husband, this difficult-learning, genuinely trying man, and she believed him. August 14th, she said. He looked at her. Yes. I would like to spend it somewhere that isn't here, she said. Not Charlottesville. Somewhere we haven't been. Somewhere new. A long pause. I know a place, he said. On the Shenandoah. My father took me once when I was young. There's a family there. Farmers, they rent out rooms in summer. Do you remember their name? She asked. He looked at her. Then very carefully he smiled. I'll find out, he said. She let herself smile back. It was small. It was careful. It was not the resolution of anything. The accounts of the past 6 years were still open, still requiring the long, patient work of two people deciding every morning to choose each other. It was not the end, but it was the sound of a door that had been moving very slowly in one direction, beginning with great effort and the particular grace of things that are genuinely meant to move the other way. And Clara Whitmore Ashford, who had stopped waiting and started living, who had built a life from the ground up with her own 2 hands, who knew the names of every family on Foster Road and could stake a bean plant at dawn and walk into a burning house without hesitating. This woman sat across from her husband and let herself believe quietly, carefully, with all the hard-won wisdom of a woman who had learned the difference between hope and waiting, that this time was different. Not because he promised, because she had watched him, and what she had seen was real. He found out the family's name on the Shenandoah. He told her at breakfast 2 days later. Set down his coffee, looked at her across the table and said, The Holloways. Samuel and Frances Holloway. They've been farming that land since 1798. 3 sons, 1 daughter. The daughter is married now and lives on the adjacent property. Clara looked at him. You wrote to them, she said. Yesterday morning, he said. They have a room available the week of August 14th. Frances Holloway, Mrs. Holloway. She wrote back same day. He paused. She said the river is low that time of year and good for walking, and that she makes apple butter. Clara's breath caught. He saw it. He said nothing about it. He simply held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who had written down that her mother made apple butter and understood what it meant without being told. All right, she said quietly. All right, he said. They left on the morning of August 13th, so they would arrive before dark. Mrs. Boone packed a basket without being asked. Thomas Calloway brought the wagon around at 6. Margaret came by not for any particular reason, just to see them off, she said, though Clara suspected the entire county had somehow become aware that something significant was happening, and Margaret Calloway had appointed herself unofficial witness. She stood at the gate while Nathaniel loaded the bags, and she looked at Clara with the direct, warm appraisal of a woman who has earned the right to an opinion. You look different, Margaret said. Do I? Yes. Margaret tilted her head. You look like somebody who decided something. I decided something in July, Clara said. Different decision, Margaret said firmly. Clara looked at her for a moment. Don't read too much into it, she said. I'm not reading anything, Margaret said pleasantly. I'm just noting what I see. Nathaniel came around the side of the wagon. He stopped beside Clara and looked at Margaret with the expression he'd been developing over these months on Foster Road, not the landlord expression, the other one, the one that acknowledged a person as a person. Mrs. Calloway, he said, how is Thomas's hand this week? Margaret blinked, just slightly, the blink of a woman who is being pleasantly surprised and is choosing not to show too much of it. Strong enough to manage a plow, she said. Dr. Carter is very pleased. Good, Nathaniel said, and then without ceremony, without making it into anything larger than it was. He's a good man. Give him my regards. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara. Clara looked back with the expression that said, yes, I know. I'm watching too. The wagon moved out of the gate and down the road, and Clara did not look back at the manor. She looked forward at the road, at the morning, at the particular quality of an August day in Virginia that is already warm at 6 and full of the sound of birds who have not yet gotten tired of summer. Nathaniel drove. She sat beside him. They did not talk for the first hour, which was entirely comfortable and nothing like the old silences. Then he said, tell me about a Thursday I missed. She looked at him. Which one? Any one, he said. One before I started coming. Tell me something I don't know. So she told him about the first Thursday she had gone to Mrs. Dodd's house, about the way the kitchen had been fiercely clean, and how Edmund had climbed down from his chair to stand beside her. About what it had felt like to sit in someone's kitchen and listen, really listen for 4 hours. He listened. She told him about the Tuesday the sewing circle had reached 20 women, about Mrs. Adeline Potts's opinions on thread tension, which were absolute and correct, and how Ruth Greer could hem a collar in the time it took most people to thread a needle. He asked questions, real ones, not the questions of a man making conversation, but the questions of a man who wants to understand a world he was excluded from by his own inattention. They stopped at noon at a farm, where a family sold cider and bread, and they ate at a wooden table in the yard, and the farmer's wife came out and looked at them with the friendly curiosity of a woman accustomed to travelers. Where are you headed? She asked. Shenandoah, Nathaniel said. The Holloway farm. Oh, Frances Holloway's place. The woman's face opened into genuine warmth. She's the best cook in the valley. You'll eat well. I've heard that, Nathaniel said. He glanced at Clara. My wife told me about the apple butter. Clara had not told him about the apple butter. That was what she had said at breakfast, that Mrs. Holloway made apple butter. She had not told him why it mattered. He had known anyway. The farmer's wife looked between them with the quick, experienced assessment of a woman who reads people the way some people read weather. First trip together? She asked. Clara looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Clara. Yes, he said. Then you'd better enjoy it, the woman said cheerfully, and went back inside. They arrived at the Holloway farm in the late afternoon. Frances Holloway was 60 and had the physical presence of a woman who had been doing hard work her entire life and found it agreeable. She shook Nathaniel's hand with a grip that surprised him. Clara saw his eyebrows move and embraced Clara with the uncomplicated warmth of a woman who had decided to like you before you arrived. I heard about you, Frances said to Clara, holding her at arm's length to look at her properly. From the County Supply Network. You're the one who organized the Foster Road drive. I had help, Clara said. You always say that, Frances said, as though she already knew this about her. Samuel says that's how you know who actually did the work. They're the ones giving credit away. She looked at Nathaniel. And you, she said. You funded the well casings. Nathaniel said, the county should have done it sooner. Yes, Frances said. They should have. A pause. You should have too, if we're being honest. Clara held her breath. Nathaniel looked at Francis Holloway for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I should have." Francis nodded once with the satisfied expression of a woman who has tested something and found it solid. "Supper's at 7, she said. "The room has a view of the river." The birthday itself arrived with the quietness that August mornings have warm already, the light coming in low and gold birdsong outside the window of the room with the river view. Clara lay still for a moment before opening her eyes. She was 27 years old. She thought about 26. About the portrait in the hallway, and the journal, and the beans, and the burning house, and the ledger she had found on his desk. She thought about the woman who had stood in the hallway and whispered into the dark. She thought about what it had cost to stop waiting and what she had found when she stopped. She opened her eyes. Nathaniel was already awake. Sitting in the chair by the window, dressed with a small package in his hands that he was holding, the way you hold something when you're not sure it's enough. She sat up. He looked at her. "Happy birthday," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely without performance. "Thank you," she said. He held out the package. She took it. Inside was a green leather book. Not her mother's. Not old. New, the leather was soft and uncracked, the pages blank and cream-colored waiting. But the same size, the same shape, the same particular shade of green. Clara's throat closed entirely. She looked at him. "I know I can't give you back the years," he said. "I know I can't give you what you should have had, but I thought—" He stopped. "You told me your mother kept her accounts in a green leather book. You told me that was where she kept the things that mattered." He looked at her steadily. "I thought you might like somewhere to keep yours." She looked at the book. She thought about her mother writing in her green leather book with a shaking hand in the last year of her life. She thought about what it meant to keep things that mattered. She thought about everything she had been keeping in her journal, in her memory, in the careful accumulation of these months, and the idea of having somewhere real to put it. "Nathaniel," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I want to say something," she said. He was still. "I have been angry at you," she said. "Not in a loud way. In the quiet way that's harder to see and harder to stop. I have been carrying that anger for a long time, and I didn't tell you because I didn't think you could hold it." He said nothing. "I think now," she said carefully, "that you can." He exhaled very slowly. "Tell me," he said. So she did. She told him all of it. Not with cruelty. She was not a cruel woman, and had no interest in being one, but with the clean, direct honesty of a woman who has spent a year learning what it costs to swallow the truth. She told him what it had been like to stand in the ballroom and feel him searching for her name. She told him what it had been like to climb those stairs alone and stand in front of that portrait. She told him what she had found when she started going to the village, not just the work, but herself. Who she had been before she became Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford. He listened. He did not defend himself. He did not explain. He did not redirect or minimize. He sat in the chair by the window and listened to the whole of it, and when she finished, he said, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix any of it." "No," she said. "It doesn't. But I mean it." "I know you do," she said. "That's the difference." They sat with that for a moment. The weight of it, the realness of it, the particular relief that comes from having said the true thing and had it received. Then Clara said, "Francis Holloway makes apple butter." Nathaniel blinked at the shift. "She does," he said carefully. "I would like to go downstairs," Clara said, "and have breakfast and ask her for the recipe." He looked at her. "She won't give it," Clara said. "No woman with a recipe like that gives it away. But I want to ask." "Why?" "Because my mother never gave hers away either," Clara said. "And I want to know what it feels like to ask for something you know you won't get and be perfectly fine with that." Something moved across his face that she had no clean word for. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who is genuinely delighted by the particular, specific, irreplaceable person sitting across from him. "All right," he said. "And then I want to walk by the river," she said, and I want you to tell me something you've never told anyone." He raised his eyebrows. "That's a significant request." "It's my birthday." He looked at her for a long moment. "I was afraid of my father," he said, immediately, without pause, as though he had been waiting for the right moment to put this down, and had recognized it as soon as it arrived. "My whole life I managed things because if something was managed, it couldn't go wrong, and if nothing went wrong, my father couldn't find a reason to look at me the way he looked at things that disappointed him." A pause. "I ran the estate the same way. I ran everything the same way, including—" He stopped. "Including our marriage," she said quietly. "Yes." The room was very still. "I am not my father," he said. "I know that. I've known it for years. But I kept running things his way because it was the only way I knew." He looked at her directly. "Until I watched you run things your way and understood there was another way entirely." Clara held the green leather book in her hands. She thought about everything that had led to this room this morning. This man saying the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. She thought, this is the person behind the person. This is who is in there. She said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded once. "Shall we go ask for the recipe?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Let's." Frances Holloway, as predicted, did not give the recipe. She laughed when Clara asked a real laugh, full and unguarded, and said, "I have been asked for that recipe 41 years, and I have never given it once, and I do not intend to start today." "I suspected as much," Clara said. "But I will tell you," Frances said, leaning over the breakfast table with the conspiratorial air of a woman sharing something important, "that the secret is patience. Most people rush the cooking. You cannot rush it." She sat back. "You cannot rush most things worth having." Clara looked at Nathaniel across the table. He looked back. Frances Holloway looked between them and said nothing. But she refilled their coffee with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has seen something she was hoping to see. They walked by the river after breakfast. The Shenandoah in August was low and clear, and moved with the slow, unhurried confidence of something that knows exactly where it is going and has no anxiety about getting there. They walked along the bank without a destination, and the morning was warm and quiet around them, and Clara carried the green leather book under her arm. At some point, Nathaniel said, "I want to rebuild the portrait." She looked at him. "What?" "The one in the hallway," he said. "I want to commission a new one." He paused. "One where we're looking at each other." Clara stopped walking. He stopped too. She looked at him on the bank of the Shenandoah on her 27th birthday. This man she had almost given up on and had chosen instead, and she thought her mother had been right. You know when the keeping is worth the cost. "All right," she said. "All right. Yes." She started walking again. "But we choose the painter together." "Of course," he said. They walked. The river moved beside them, easy and clear, going somewhere certain. That autumn, the new portrait was commissioned from a painter in Philadelphia. It took 3 months and arrived at Ashford Manor on a Wednesday in December, wrapped in canvas and rope. Nathaniel carried it up the stairs himself. He hung it at the end of the hallway in the same place as the old one. In this portrait, Clara and Nathaniel Ashford were not looking at the painter. They were looking at each other. Mrs. Boone saw it first coming up the stairs with the evening linens. She stopped. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went back downstairs without saying anything, but she had an expression on her face that lasted the rest of the week. Margaret Calloway saw it when she came for Thursday supplies. She stood in front of it for almost a minute, and then said, "Now that's a proper portrait," in the tone of a woman delivering a definitive verdict. Dr. Carter saw it during a December visit to assess the Pemberton boys' progress. He looked at it briefly, then looked at Clara, and nodded once with the precise economy of a man who says what needs to be said and nothing extra. Victoria Caldwell, who came in January with more blankets for the winter supply drive, and who had by now become something that was not quite a friend to Clara, but was certainly more honest than an enemy, stood in front of the portrait and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Is that what it looks like when someone sees you?" "Yes," Clara said. Victoria was quiet. I wouldn't know, she said. You will, Clara said. When you stop performing for rooms. Victoria looked at her sharply. Then slowly, the sharpness softened into something real. That's rather direct, she said. You once told me I used to be very careful, Clara said. I told you I still am. I'm just more careful about what I'm careful for. Victoria looked back at the portrait. I'm working on it, she said quietly. I know you are, Clara said. I can see it. On the last evening of that January, a county gathering was held at the Caldwell estate. Thomas Caldwell's annual winter dinner, which was not as large as Nathaniel's summer celebration, but was more significant socially because the county board attended, and the decisions made in the parlor afterward had a way of becoming policy. Clara wore the same pale blue silk she had worn in July. Not because it was her only option. Because it was the dress she had been wearing on the night everything changed, and she had decided it deserved a different memory attached to it. They arrived together, walked in together, and when Colonel Hayes, back from Richmond for a second visit this time with 2 colleagues, crossed the room to greet them. He looked at Clara with the recognition of a man who has encountered someone once and found them worth remembering. Mrs. Ashford, he said, I've been hearing remarkable things about the Foster Road Initiative. 3 well casings. The supply drives the infrastructure survey. This is exactly the kind of county self-sufficiency the federal representatives want to see. The county did the work, Clara said. I just helped organize it. That's not what I heard, Hayes said. Clara looked at him steadily. Then you heard correctly, she said, and I stand by what I said. Hayes blinked. Then he laughed a real laugh surprised out of him. He looked at Nathaniel. Your wife, he said, is the most direct person I have met in Virginia. Yes, Nathaniel said, and the pride in his voice was so plain, so unguarded, so entirely real, that Clara felt it like sunlight on her face. Hayes moved on. Nathaniel turned to her. She looked at him. He took her hand. Not the social gesture, not the performance of a husband and wife at a public gathering. He took her hand the way you take hold of something you intend to keep. Are you all right? He asked. Yes, she said. Are you? Yes. He looked at her. Clara. Yes. I know your name, he said quietly. She looked at him. I know your birthday, and your mother's name, and your favorite book this month, and that you're afraid of thunderstorms, and that you gave your corn cake to Briggs's dog. He held her hand. I know that you walked into a burning house because standing outside was not something you were willing to do. I know that you built something in this county that will outlast anything I have ever put my name on. He paused. I know you. Clara looked at this man who had once stood in a room full of people and gone silent where her name should have been. She looked at him and understood that knowing someone was not a destination. It was a practice, a daily choosing, a discipline of attention that required you to show up for it again and again, not because it was easy, but because the person in front of you was worth the showing up. She understood that she knew him too. The ledger and the wounded pride and the father he had been afraid of and the man he was working to become and the way he drove a wagon and held his coffee cup and went still when he was thinking something he wasn't yet ready to say. She knew him. I know, she said. She held his hand back, and in the ballroom of the Caldwell estate in the county of Ashford, Virginia, in the winter of 1818, surrounded by the people of a community, they had both in their different ways learned to see. Clara Whitmore. Ashford stood beside her husband and knew with the full certainty of a woman who had stopped waiting and started living that this was not a story about a man who forgot his wife's name. This was a story about 2 people who had to lose each other before they understood what it meant to choose. She had chosen. He had chosen. And they kept choosing every Thursday on Foster Road, every Tuesday in the church hall, every morning at the breakfast table, every evening in the sitting room, with the lamp burning between them, they kept choosing. That is what love looks like when it is real. Not a single moment of recognition, 1,000 small acts of showing up, day after day, name after name after name.